So hi guys, my name is Nishchal and I'm going to be covering the topic cardiac output and regulation, which is a part of cardiovascular physiology, which is also one of the final exam questions. So first thing we need to discuss is what is cardiac output. So cardiac output is basically the amount of blood which would be pumped by the heart per unit time. So the unit that we would use is liter per minute, and it represents the efficiency of the heart in pumping oxygenated blood to all the tissues in the body. So the formula that we use here is heart rate into stroke volume. And normally we say that the cardiac output is around 4 to 8 liters per minute, but it really varies with a lot of factors such as age, body size, or physical activity. And on the right, you can see a graph which shows the cardiac output in men and women. So we see that with age, both in men and women, the cardiac output is decreasing, and also cardiac output tends to be higher in men than women. So the next topic is heart rate. So heart rate is mainly regulated by sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system would actually cause tachycardia for flight, fright, or flight response, while parasympathetic innervation, it causes bradycardia, and parasympathetic innervation in heart rate is mainly by the vagus nerve, which decreases heart rate. And also we have some hormonal mechanisms like epinephrine and norepinephrine, which regulate the heart rate. There's also a concept of maximum heart rate. It is the maximum amount of times that the heart could beat, and above that, it would actually be dangerous to the body. And we use the formula 220 minus age of the person to calculate the maximum heart rate of a person. And even heart rate, it varies a lot with exercise, age, body size, and other factors as well. The next thing is stroke volume. So the stroke volume is the volume of blood which is ejected by the ventricles with every contraction of the heart. We use the formula end diastolic volume, which is the amount of blood that would be in the ventricles at the end of diastole. And we use end systolic volume, which is the amount of blood at the end of systole. So we use end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume to calculate stroke volume. And on the right, you can see a graph which says that with increasing end diastolic volume, with increasing ventricular end diastolic volume, we see an increase in stroke volume, but only up to a certain level, because after that we have the mechanism of Frank-Starling, which does not permit more stroke volume to be increased. Next is regulation of stroke volume. So stroke volume mainly depends on three factors: preload, contractility, and afterload, which I'll explain further. But we see that even heart rate also has an inverse relation to stroke volume. And in the graph over here, you can see that with increasing heart rate, the stroke volume also increases, but only up to a certain level. And the reason behind this is that with increasing heart rate, you have increased stroke volume, but after a period of time, the increasing heart rate does not permit enough filling in the ventricles of blood. So if you cannot fill the ventricles with blood, you will not have increased stroke volume. So the stroke volume eventually plateaus and then may decrease as well. So the first thing is preload. So preload is the amount of blood that would be in the ventricles just before ventricles contract. And we can also call it as end diastolic volume as well. The factors that mainly affect preload are venous return. So venous return is the flow of blood from the veins into the right atrium. And venous return, it mainly depends on the right atrial pressure. So we see that blood is a fluid and it flows from high pressure to low pressure. So if there's negative pressure in the atrium, the blood would flow from the vena cava into the right atrium. So with increasing negative pressure, we have increased venous return. But as the right atrial pressure goes positive, we see a decrease in venous return. While the opposite is for cardiac output. With negative atrial pressure, we see a minimal amount of cardiac output, while with increasing atrial pressure, cardiac output as well increases. Then there's Frank-Starling mechanism. So Frank-Starling mechanism is the ability of the heart to change its force of contraction depending on the amount of venous return that we have. So it just simply says that the strength of contraction would increase when the ventricle is more stretched apart. But even in this, we have some limitations. If the ventricular and diastolic volume keeps increasing, at a certain point, there will be no actin-myosin binding occurring in the ventricle, in the myocytes of the ventricles. So you would have eventually decreased amount of stroke volume. In the graph on the left, we see a positive and negative inotropic effect, which simply is that increased strength of contraction would increase stroke volume, whereas decreased strength of contraction would decrease the stroke volume, according to the Frank-Starling law. The next is contractility. So contractility is the ability of the heart to contract. The main factors that affect contractility in the heart are the concentration of calcium that is present intracellularly, but also the actin-myosin cross-filament bridging as well. But contractility can be affected by neural mechanisms, humoral mechanisms, and even local factors can increase or decrease the contractility of the heart. The next is afterload. So afterload, we could define it as the resistance or the pressure that the heart must work against so that the ventricles can eject blood out of the heart. So afterload, since it's a pressure against which the heart has to work, if there's any kind of valve resistance, viscosity of the blood, or increased pressure in the thorax, that would cause increased afterload because the pressure has to be much higher, and therefore the cardiac workload would increase as well. On the right, you can see the diagram which differentiates preload from afterload so that you can understand it really well. The next is cardiac output during exercise. So since during exercise, we see that cardiac output is increased, and the reason for this is to meet the oxygen requirements of the body. The main factors that contribute to this are increased heart rate. So we see the activation of sympathetic nervous system as well as activation of hormones such as epinephrine and norepinephrine, which increase the heart rate. We also see an increased amount of